Amazing. So thank you so much for having me here. So what does it mean to live with and through forms of environmental degradation and despair, to share our world with objects, and to be reduced to an object, even as you create them? So as I mentioned, I'm Dr. Kerry Mclnerney, and I'm a researcher at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence, where I explore issues relating to gender, race, and technology. I'm the co-host of the Good Robot podcast, which explores issues relating to gender, tech, and feminism. And I would really encourage you to check that out if you're interested in the things that I've been mentioning today. But I want to present to you some research from maybe a slightly different project. I'm working on a monograph called Yellow Techno Peril, Anti-Asian Racism and Artificial Intelligence. And this is the first time I'm presenting some new research from that book today. And so I would really encourage your critical feedback. It's also the most theoretical work I've presented in a long time, so please bear with me and the inevitable tongue twisters I'm sure will arise. So, very, very vigorous. There we go. So as I mentioned, my book explores anti-Asian racism and AI, but what does this have to do with the question of sustainable AI? So one angle that I really believe in is that Asian American and Asian diaspora studies has a particular unique perspective to offer here when it comes to thinking about the planetary impact and endeavor of AI, given its disciplinary expertise in global migratory flows. For despite its imbrication in nationalist politics, AI, as we all here I think agree, is undoubtedly a planetary endeavor and one with immense planetary costs. So the AI Now report from 2023 highlights how the constant push for scale in AI systems has led big tech firms to develop hugely energy-intensive computational models that optimize for accuracy rather than for sustainability. And as many people at this conference have foregrounded very beautifully and importantly, the impact of these energy-intensive models are not shared equitably, and they follow historical patterns of environmental racism. And take, for example, a problem that has been mentioned, which is that of e-waste, and the colonial inequalities in who handles this waste and where this waste is inevitably dumped. And I'm very indebted here to the work of Max Lebuarin in Pollution is Colonialism. But e-waste also raises for me a different kind of issue, one related to these questions of allocentric design that Tom has just brought up, how we relate to AI systems and the inorganic waste that they produce over time. This brings me to the main argument of what will be my third book chapter. So existing scholarship on techno-orientalism and what Lung Tibui aptly calls the model machine myth demonstrates how the racialization of Asian people as inorganic objects has played a central role in driving forms of imperial domination and continues to shape contemporary racial stereotypes of the so-called model minority. But, inspired by Anlin Cheng's question, how can we find beauty in a broken world? I ask, can Asian American and Asian diasporic approaches to objecthood and our fictional and non-fictional meditations, or what it means to be construed as inorganic matter, offer us a different kind of relational ethics with object, one that produces an alternative temporal and ethical horizon for coexisting with the objects that are considered to be waste? So our current approach to waste, including e-waste, is one that fundamentally is colonial or premised on bad relations. So Max Lebuarin writes that state-based environmental regulations in most of the world since the 1930s are premised on the logic of assimilative capacity, in which a body, water, human or otherwise, can handle a certain amount of contaminant before scientifically detectable harm occurs. And Lebuarin calls this the threshold theory of pollution. And so consequently, Lebuarin argues that pollution is not a manifestation or a side effect of colonialism, but it is rather an enactment of ongoing colonial relations to land. That is, pollution is best understood as the violence of colonial land relations rather than environmental damage, and this damage itself, they say, is a symptom of that violence. And so the idea that I'm currently trying to work through, albeit finding it quite knotty and quite thorny, is that through alternative histories of the natural-artificial and the human-object divide, Asian American science fiction and scholarship can help us reframe sustainable AI, not as a question of mere assimilation through the model of a threshold amount of damage that the Earth can supposedly absorb, but instead help us pursue sustainable AI as a question of good relations. So for those of you who are maybe less familiar with Asian American and Asian diasporic scholarship on techno-Orientalism, this area of literary and cultural inquiry examines how Asianness has historically served as the toggle between the natural and the unnatural, the human and the machine, from the mechanical Turk and its Orientalist trappings through to the sexy cyborgs of science fiction cinema today. And Anne Lin-Ching notes how this objectification has operated on distinctly gendered lines, from the masculine mechanicity of the coolie and the contemporary techno-Orientalist framing of China as a human factory, through to the hyper-feminine and hyper-sexualized ornament that Anne Cheng describes with her portmanteau ornamentalism. Here, Oriental femininity is codified and transformed into a material aesthetic, a decorative property that can be dislocated from the Asian body and commodified, consumed, and circulated. These different genderings of Asiatic objectification, Cheng argues, coalesce in the strangely androgynous figure of the cyborg, evoking both mechanical masculine labor and decorative feminine aesthetic. But Asian American speculative fiction and science fiction epitomizes what Candace Chud describes as Asian American studies as imperative to imagine otherwise. It elucidates the lived experience and visceral bodily sensation of being objectified and living life as an object. And yet somehow these stories explore, beyond and against all odds, how allocentrism can somehow spring forth within the dominative structures of colonial violence. So how do they do this? First, they explore how this kind of racial objectification is central to capitalist expansion, rather than being an accidental side effect of it. These stories foreground alternative histories of environmental damage that do not frame e-waste and other kinds of planetary degradation as a side effect of progress with a capital P, but rather as a deliberate political project. And I think this is really important that we're pushing against this particular capital P progress narrative when we consider how certain AI models, particularly large language models, are increasingly being positioned as foundation models, and in doing so might be selling us into the supposed inevitability of these technological developments, rather than seeing them as deliberate economic and political choices. In his book, The Whites Are Enemies of Heaven, Mark O'Driscoll argues that a turning point in the history of pollution was the First Opium War, where the Qing dynasty's leading carbon-neutral economy was defeated by the environmentally extractive British one. And in this book, he details 3 political processes of racial and environmental domination as integral to what he calls climate Caucasianism, or CO2 colonialism, carbon colonialism. These processes are warfare, traditional colonial violence, lawfare, the use of law and academical cultural knowledge, including concepts of rationality to dominate, and thirdly, rawfare, the transformation of people into raw commodities or objects that can be used to fuel imperialist capitalist production. And I focus here on O'Driscoll's concept of rawfare because I think it perfectly encapsulates what I call the life cycle of Asian objects under imperial and neo-colonial capitalism, the objectification of Asian people, turning them into a product that labors and produces value through their own wastage. And what do I mean by this? So as Donna Haraway famously noted in her essay, The Cyborg Manifesto, cyborg bodies exist at the interface of the digital and the fleshly. But there's a question of labor, I think, in her essay that needs to be further interrogated. Haraway briefly mentions this question of labor through a brief and somewhat Orientalist reference to Asian women's nimble fingers. But as Anne Lin-Ching argues, this question of labor is brought, I think, into much sharper relief by the feminine figure of the Asian cyborg. For like Melissa Wright's Disposable Women in her work on the Chinese women who work under brutal conditions to produce electronics in factories, Asiatic cyborgs are shown to produce value through their own destruction. And we see examples of this in Ex Machina, where the gynoid Kyoko works as a silent maid and is only revealed to be a robot partway through the film. And we see a similar dynamic at play with the clones in Cloud Atlas, who are literally turned into the substance soap, pictured here, that they consume in order to fuel their labor. So when it comes to thinking about AI and e-waste, I want to highlight Chen Chufan's novel, Waste Tide, which I think epitomizes the rawfare of contemporary tech development and AI development as demonstrated by the lives of the waste people who clean up tech waste that's dumped on the fictional Silicon Isle. But I also want to foreground maybe some different narratives and some different stories which are getting told too. Take, for example, Larissa Lai's Saltfish Girl, which portrays a dystopian future that has far too much resonance with our contemporary present. Larissa Lai pictures a world where clones have been made from the DNA of interned Japanese Americans, spliced with just enough fish or cat DNA to render them patentable objects by corporations. But the clones in this novel strike back. They rebel, they form their own communities, and crucially, they learn how to independently reproduce themselves through the uncontrollable and feminine force of the durian fruit. Their rebellion is short-lived, as they are brutally slaughtered by the capitalist regime that controls their lives and technically owns their bodies. But their ability to exist and reproduce outside of the control of corporations lives on. And this brings me to my second and closing argument, that by showing how objects, in the words of Fred Moten, can and do resist, Asian American studies contributes to a much wider body of work by Black studies, critical race theory, feminist studies, and queer theory that examines how agency can operate beyond the human, how our lives are shaped by material infrastructures like the trash and waste that surround us, and what kinds of deformations of freedom, in the words of Alexander G. Wahilia, can be found in the absence of liberal autonomous personhood. Finally, how these deformations of freedom can possibly lead us to different kinds of relational ethics. And if I have time, I want to close with one quick final example. So, last year I took part in an Asian diasporic art project called Home X, which was created by the British Asian arts group Kakilang. So for this project, we were encouraged to record our experiences of home, how we understood our own diasporic travels, our own experiences of intraplanetary movement. Our bodies and our stories were then captured and inserted into a game virtual reality environment. This art piece was then consecutively displayed both in the UK and in Hong Kong, creating digital diasporic links. And I can't go into a lot of detail about this project. It was such a rich and beautiful piece of artwork. But one line that someone else said in this story really stood out to me. They were talking about what it meant to be at home, and they said, "But we are all migrants of the earth." And in this beautiful digital disconnected and yet hyper-connected world, there's something that really struck me about this line, and it made me think perhaps art projects like this, which somehow manage to use technology to encourage us to think of our shared planetary home, even as we cope with diasporic experiences of disappearance and loss, can offer us different kinds of pathways to imagining and ethics of sustainable AI. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You were well on time. Yeah. Thank you. Made my job easy. So we do have time for questions in person, and I will, of course, check the Q&A online. Any questions in the room for our... Sure, I see. And then we have one at the...
Thanks a lot for your talk. That was really interesting. In your talk and also in other talks at this conference, the term colonial and colonialism is being used very frequently. And I was wondering, what kind of definition of these terms would you offer, or can you offer any definitions? Because I'm feeling that maybe the term might be overused a little bit in this context, but maybe I'm getting this wrong. So I'm just curious about how you understand this term.
Yeah, of course. I think in this particular context, and again, I think, there's of course a wide range of ways that we can think about what colonialism is. I'm particularly, again, kind of drawing a lot on Max Lebaran's work of thinking about colonialism as being a particular kind of relationship to land, one which is based on extraction and ownership, rather than kind of recognizing this way that we exist within land and cooperatively with it. And so I think I'm also interested in work that is then engaging with how different kinds and vectors of settler colonialism are enacting these different kinds of appropriative relationships to land. And I think, again, I would really foreground Lebaran's work because I think often colonialism does get conflated with a lot of other kinds of forms of domination or extraction. And while I think, of course, there's overlaps and slippages there, I wanted to bring the focus back to this particular kind of land relation. And that's where I think, Lebaran mainly looks at plastics. I think e-waste is also a really interesting example here because it brings forth this question of that colonial relationship with land, because unlike things like water toxicity, for example, the land cannot absorb plastics or e-waste, and makes that colonial relationship very overt, which is obviously catastrophic in terms of the environmental degradation, but in some ways, I think, makes this very visible. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah.
Thanks. Tomasz?
Yes, thanks, Kerry. That's brilliant. I'm wondering about the lens of Asian diaspora studies, and if you could maybe, especially to those of us who might not be very familiar with the kind of critical race theory that you're referencing, what is specifically useful about this lens? I mean, your whole presentation was about that, but I wonder specifically about the Asian diaspora element and how that goes beyond borders without, I assume, this universalizing imperative behind. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll probably give quite an unformed answer, so forgive me. I guess maybe my easiest entryway into this is when I started this job or started in AI ethics, it was very hard for me to give a talk about anything without being asked about two things. One was sex robots, because I worked on gender and AI, and the other one was anything to do with AI in China or technology in China. And I found it very hard to understand how much of that is because I am Chinese, or how much of that is simply because there is an obsession, I think, right now with China's tech development. And I'm very interested in the geopolitical questions around AI and tech. I don't think that's an illegitimate interest to have, but I was really interested in trying to segregate how much of people's associations of me and my kind of identity and my research area was drawing them inevitably to this question of kind of China and Asianness and tech. And so I found it particularly helpful to kind of go back to this long trajectory in Asian American and Asian diaspora studies, which has been thinking about how East Asian people in particular have been racialized in the US, in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand in a particular way as somehow kind of innately mechanical, machine-like. And there's amazing scholars like Eric Hayo, Kyla Schuller, who trace the constitution of the sort of indentured Asian laboring body under British imperial capitalism, and how that particular kind of labor extraction was justified through the idea that these were machine-like bodies, that Chinese people couldn't feel as much pain, they had an endless capacity for boredom, and they were able to work very hard. And so there's also a lot of work in this particular area, I think, that traces the legacy of these kinds of ideas and stereotypes. And I think we encounter those stereotypes in lots of kind of, small and egregious ways to like much bigger ways as well. And so I think for me, one aspect of this area of scholarship that I highlighted was its emphasis on kind of global planetary flows. I also think there's something else when it comes to ideas of complicity and discomfort and sort of ambiguity in relation to power. I'm really interested in work on Asian settler colonialism and thinking about how often a lot of Asian diasporic experiences are about having a kind of quasi-intimacy with forms of domination and access to them, while also constantly being reconstituted as this sort of outsider against whom, violence is directed, but also through whom certain kinds of state projects are justified. But I'll stop there, because otherwise I'll just keep talking.
Thank you.
If not, okay, otherwise.
Yeah, first, thank you very much. Just one very short question, drawing on the term of techno-orientalism. Would you say that there is kind of counter-discourse, techno-occidentalism in Asia exists?
Could you expand on that a little bit, kind of what you mean by techno-occidentalism?
Like drawing on the term of occidentalism as some kind of a resistance discourse of people getting affected by Orientalist thinking and prejudice. This thinking transferred on the techno scene. So basically, or maybe a little rough, Asians thinking about Western people in the technosphere.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And yeah, to be completely honest with you, I don't know enough, but I will definitely think about it. I think a question that I'm particularly interested in are these forms of like self-orientalization. And so in September, I'll be in Japan kind of listening to and thinking with a lot of scholars on how there's certain kinds of national buy-in to these narratives of being very technologically adept and using that as a way to kind of sell yourself on the world stage. And so I think that particular dynamic also really interests me, recognizing that I think these aren't only like a set of stereotypes that are sort of externally imposed in one way, but that they are kind of appropriated and used and deployed. For me, though, I'm kind of interested in tracing the violent history of where these ideas came from, and also I think how they're sort of lived by maybe people who identify as being sort of East Asian diasporic, because a lot of my work isn't necessarily focused on how AI is understood, for example, in China. It's very much trying to think about what can this strand of scholarship from Asian diasporic studies and East Asian studies maybe tell us about our contemporary like Western racial imaginaries when it comes to AI. Yeah.
Thanks. Then I might ask a question, and I apologize in advance because it's perhaps unanswerable, but it's just already thinking about the interrelation between the first two presentations. And one of the things that you said that caught my attention early on is thinking about sustainable AI as good relations, or a set of good relations, if I'm quoting you or paraphrasing you correctly. So I'm sort of curious where this line of research is heading, because a lot of your sources are really interesting in things like Saltfish Girl or these sort of dystopian science fiction futures are really good at showing what can happen with bad relations if we take them, to this extreme or maybe not so extreme down the road. And then just sort of thinking about our first presentation, that's really much of this sort of practical question about, okay, how do we start to influence design now in a more productive way than we have been doing, right? So I'm curious how you see this working into this sort of idea of good relations.
Yeah, and I guess I might come at your question slightly sideways, which I think is a really good question.
Great.
It's the one that I'm really grappling with at the moment and trying to think about, if I want to put forward this more positive ethical project, how do I do that in a way that I think is honoring to the reality of the violence and the destruction, but also, maybe, again, pays attention to these kinds of forms and relationships that do somehow manage to emerge from that. I had a thought and I've just completely lost it, so hopefully it will come back. No, wow, it's gone. Drat, I was really pleased with
Save
the
it.
answer
Maybe
I had
if we have time
as
at the
well.
end, we can circle
Yes,
back.
I'm sure I will remember it at the end, but yes, maybe to be continued over drinks then.
Okay, thank you once again.
No worries.